Hello, welcome back to Books on the Go. I'm Anna and I'm here with the last bit of April wrap up. So I've just come back from London and I'm a bit behind with my videos, so I'm trying to wrap up April and then move on to some things that I've been doing in May. And I've got 4 books to talk about. The first one, which is really difficult to talk about actually. I think we're doing it on the podcast, so I need to really gather my thoughts for this one. But it's No Friend But the Mountains by Behrouz Boochani, translated by Omid Tofighian. And it's an extraordinary book, a harrowing read, but really important. And this has won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award. And a New South Wales Premier's, I think, Special Award recently. And it's Behrouz Boochani has written this from Manus Island Prison, where he's been held since 2013. And he came as a Kurdish refugee by boat heading to Australia seeking asylum, and was detained in Manus Island. I think Australia is the only country which processes asylum seekers offshore if they come by boat, and he was caught by that policy. He has written this via text message or WhatsApp messages, and they've been sent to his translator, and they have produced this book. So it's a remarkable work, and really, as I said, harrowing. I had heard about this. It's had sort of word of mouth publicity and attention, and rightly so. And so I went into it and I expected to be shocked because he describes the conditions that these asylum seekers are held in the detention centre or prison. And that's a really important thing. He doesn't buy into the language of the Australian government, and the names that they give things he doesn't accept, and he uses his own language, or he chooses his words that he thinks describes them and more accurately. And so I expected to be shocked, and I was more shocked than I thought I would be, and really genuinely upset and quite ashamed actually of being an Australian. So it was really tough to read, but it is beautifully written. And so the things that struck me, one is the policy itself. So he is seeking asylum, and under international law we are a party to the Convention on the Status of Refugees, which means that we're bound to give them asylum in our country, and yet Australia detains them offshore. And indeed, the policy just after he arrived was changed to state that, the law was changed, not just the policy, that anyone who arrives by boat will not be settled in Australia. So there are some serious questions about the legality of that by our government, but nevertheless, that was what they put in place. And so that meant that he was held indefinitely, and they were given very little information, and indeed sometimes misinformation about what would happen to them. So there's the policy itself. And then what really struck me was, because I knew a bit about the policy, but I was shocked by the way it was implemented on the ground, and the treatment that these people have received by the guards, basically prison guards, which is outsourced to a security contractor. I think it's GS4 is the company, and there were things like, for example, two of the prisoners. They're not allowed any games or any, there's no soccer ball or anything like that to pass the time. And 2 of them find a magic marker and draw a backgammon board and improvise a backgammon game. And one of the guards takes it away and scratches it out and says, "No games." And I just thought that's really unnecessarily cruel when you have people who are just trying to get by. And the other thing about it that he draws out very intelligently is the Kafkaesque system that they have. So it's the way that no one is accountable. So the guards will say to them, well, this is the policy, or these are the rules, or they'll get onto their walkie-talkie and says, no, the boss says you can't do it. And yet, if you ask someone in Canberra who is the supposed boss or the department who's created these rules, they would say, well, we've provided good conditions and we've got, hygienic toilets and they've got access to telephones and food. And, they would say they have nothing to do with the mistreatment. And no one is accountable. No one really seems to take responsibility, and there's that nightmarish sense that generates, and it goes further than that because it gets to the point of violence and death and of some of the prisoners. So it is confronting. I think it's really important. It's a hard book to read, but the writing makes it quite readable, and it is actually a book you do want to keep finding out what is happening. He's an engaging narrator, and there's some parts of it that are written in poetry and sometimes very heartbreaking. So I really recommend this. It's No Friend But the Mountains, and he's still on Manus Island. I think they've closed down the prison, but as far as I know, he's still there, and I'm not sure what his options are in terms of moving off the island. So it's a really strange and, as I said, sort of Kafkaesque existence for these people. So that was that one. And then the next one has some correspondence, but funnily enough touches on a similar issue, and that's Spring by Ali Smith, which I loved. And this is the third in her Brexit quartet. So Amanda and I have read Autumn and Winter and now Spring, which we just talked about on the podcast. And it is two stories that she weaves together. One is Richard, who's a TV producer who is past his best. He's getting older and mourning the death of his friend Paddy, who was a screenwriter, and feeling depressed. And he's travelling north on a train journey, and we meet him at the platform. And then it has the story of Brittany, who calls herself Brit, and she's a guard at a detention centre, which is remarkably like a prison. And there's a scene actually where one of the detainees talks about the prison, and she says it's not a prison, it's a purpose-built immigration removal centre with a prison design. And so, of course, that made me think of the Manus Island No Friend But the Mountains, because he, again, they call that a detention centre or a processing centre, and he uses different language quite deliberately to say, I'm not accepting the words that they use to disguise what they're doing. And I think Ali Smith brings this out beautifully in a fictional setting. So Brit is really interesting because she's the prison guard who you see how poorly they treat the prisoners. But you also see, because it's told from her point of view, how someone could become part of that system. And in her case, someone who's reasonably intelligent and just didn't have the option to go to university or to have a more fulfilling job, perhaps, because of her family circumstances. So it gives you, and I really liked that, just an idea, it gives you some empathy for those people as well. And so then she meets Richard, and they meet through a girl called Florence, who is possibly a supernatural character, but Ali Smith always does that in a way that it's just part of the story, and you don't have to get too worried about, is it real or not real, or she's just real enough to keep the story going and to make you think. So I loved this. I loved the relationship between Richard and Paddy, which he's reflecting back on. And Paddy then introduces him to Catherine Mansfield, the New Zealand writer, and Rilke, the poet, and the fact that they'd met in Switzerland, or not met, but they'd been in Switzerland at the same time at the same resort, or resort might not be the word, but the same, hotel or guest house. And the way it was interesting because we were reading Lost Children Archive and talking about how many literary references are in that book and how name droppy it is, and I found it quite alienating. And yet Ali Smith can do it in a way that is so engaging and it draws you into the story. And I think because Paddy talks about them with so much enthusiasm that they become characters. So you feel like you're with Catherine Mansfield in the Swiss Alps, and she's really unwell, and then Rilke's there, but they never met, but you sort of have this sense of a story about that. And also Richard is a funny character because he's not as academic as Paddy, and he doesn't really know who they are. So as a reader, you feel like if you hadn't heard of them before, that's okay as well, because he hadn't either. And Paddy doesn't mind. She just kind of brings you into that story. And so there's an unpretentiousness to Ali Smith's writing, which I love, because you can feel how intelligent she is and how much is going on in her brain, and yet she can put it so cleanly on the page into a story that really propels you forward. So a delightful read. I actually raced through this, and I fear that I almost read it too quickly because I perhaps could go back and read it again to savour the language a bit more. But that was Spring by Ali Smith, so no surprises there. Loved this one. The next book is coming to Aussie April now, back to Australian reads, and that's Flames by Robbie Arnott. And I did this with Annie on the podcast, and we had a special guest, Sean Mooney, who we buddy read this with. So I had heard, I think I spoke about this in my Aussie April TBR video, but I'd heard about this through Simon Savage on Savage Reads, who loved it. And I'm really glad I did, because Annie and I really, really loved it. I think I liked it more than Annie did, and Sean unfortunately had to bail because there was a supernatural water rat or river god, which, understandably, I totally get why that was just too much for him. But although, to be fair, he did say when we were chatting, there are other books that he doesn't mind a supernatural element. So it's really interesting. And I'm a bit the same. It depends on the book. But this book, it's hard to talk about again. It's the story of Charlotte and Levi in Tasmania, and the Tasmanian landscape is a big part of the book and part of the story. And they are brother and sister. And their mother, the thing that happens with the women of their family is that when they die, they come back to life and then they burn. And so, and whilst that sounds bizarre, what I loved about this is on the first page, Robbie Arnott tells you this, and then he says, that wasn't uncommon in our family, or something just really down to earth that kind of makes you feel part of the story, even though that as a setup that could be quite alienating. So I was able to get on board with that. And what happens is Levi decides he doesn't want that to happen to Charlotte. So he's going to build her a coffin so that she can be buried in the ground. He doesn't really explain that to her though. So she just realizes that he's building a coffin for her, and she runs away, as you might do. She's only 22 or 23, so she thinks she's a bit young for that sort of thing. So it's a really lovely premise and very engaging writing, and she's a great character. So we follow her running away, and then he hires a detective to find her, who's another really fabulous character, a woman who drinks gin and is a bit of a spoof on the hard-boiled crime genre. But then there are other elements that come into it, and so it's hard to describe this book. But I loved it. And what I loved is that even though some of the other elements are not human, so there's one chapter from the point of view of a water rat who's the god of the Esk River. So the Esk god, he's called. And that would normally put me off, but it was only a chapter. I couldn't have done a whole book like that, but it fitted in because what I felt like Robbie Arnott was doing was giving us this whole 360-degree view of the story instead of just the human characters. And he was giving us a sense of how interconnected we all are and how connected humans are with their natural environment, and that one thing leads to another, and that what we do impacts on the wildlife and vice versa, and that none of that is sort of said. It's not preachy in any way, but that's the feeling I got from it, and I loved that originality of looking at things holistically. So the adventure goes on from there basically, and there are other characters. I think some parts are more successful than others because he does change genre for some of the characters. And I love the way he does that because it keeps it really interesting and sometimes very funny. But I thought some worked better than others. But on the whole, a really gorgeous, gorgeous book. I love his writing. It's very pacey. It's funny. It's poetic at times, and there's a real love for the Australian landscape. And so it's not a cynical book, which I liked. So yes, I recommend this. That's Flames by Robbie Arnott, and a really good one for Aussie April. I was very happy with that. And then a completely different book again, and another one for Aussie April, which is an author I've been meaning to get to, and that's Down the Hume by Peter Pilates, who's a Sydney writer. And he has a new one coming out called The Pillars. So I'm really glad I've read this, and now I'll be looking out for The Pillars, which is coming soon, I think in the next couple of months. And this is a really interesting, gritty story of a young man called Bucky or Bucks who lives in Western Sydney, so a tough area, who is finding his way basically. He's a young gay man from a Greek Australian family, and he has a boyfriend who is, or they're on again, off again, but the boyfriend's quite controlling, and he's a real gym junkie and steroid taker and that sort of some unhealthy things. He works in an aged care home, and he's just finding his way, and it's episodic in that sense. It's not a driving plot, but I really, really I don't know if enjoyed is the word, but I found it very strong. I loved getting this sense of a completely different writing style and character that I haven't met before, and point of view that I haven't seen before. And the writing was very direct, very lively. It felt authentic and quite raw at times. I loved the Greek Australian family element. I just thought that really rang true. And he uses Greek language amongst the book, which I loved, and the fact that he doesn't translate that, it just gives a layer to his, to Bucky's character. And also the relationship with his boyfriend. It's told in quite short chapters and paragraphs and scenes where you don't get a whole build up and a whole backstory. So I liked that because you have to sort of read between the lines a bit, and you get more of a sense of the relationship rather than him spelling it out for you. And then you see how that develops. Yeah, it's a real slice of life in Western Sydney, and I highly recommend it. So that's Down the Hume by Peter Pilates, and I'll be looking out for The Pillars, which I think is his next one coming soon. So that is the end of April. We're finished now with April, and I'll have some more books coming up for maybe a mid-May, or I might do my London book haul. So let me know what you've been reading, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.